Welcome back. In the last video segment, we were talking about this thing called the segmented society, and I was talking about how people lived very, by our standards anyway, isolated lives, and they were independent, and, very few people traveled out of their, orbit of where they lived and the people that they would have considered family, or at least very, very close friends. What we're going to talk about today is going to be the undoing of that segmented society. It's going to be a complete change, an aberration, a move away from what was the usual. Rapid change. If there's one way that I would describe the late 19th century, in other words, from the end of the Civil War to the dawn of the 20th century, it would be rapid change. Why? Well, let's take a look at what's going on in the economy, okay? To do that, let's talk about the Civil War for just a minute. In the Civil War, one of the primary reasons the North was able to win was it had the ability to be able to produce more things that were necessary for war. When you think about the things that are necessary for war, you need to equip your armies with things like guns, things like cannon. You need to clothe them with things like uniforms, boots, hats, all those things. You need to be able to feed them. So you're not going to be able to do this in the old craftsman way. In other words, a highly skilled shoemaker that comes and measures each soldier's foot very intimately. What you need to do is you're going to be able to have to produce things in mass. Now, one of the advantages that the North had was that's where all the factories were. That's where industrialization, if you will, really began to take grip of the nation. Now, for your notes, what industrialization simply means is mass production. It's the idea of centralizing all segments, all stages of the production process under one roof. You think about a factory. Now, that's essentially what a factory is, isn't it? You've got raw material that comes in at this end, and what leaves on the other end, that would be finished, in many cases, ready to consume goods, okay? So the Civil War teaches American manufacturing a really important lesson in the sense that if you are able to produce in mass, you're able to attract more buyers. You're able to supply the market with more of whatever it is that you're selling. Now, anytime, those of you that have taken an econ class will know what I'm talking about, anytime you've got a high supply of something, the price will come down. Well, what happens when the price comes down is you're going to attract more buyers. So think about this, even a decade ago, certainly 20 years ago, not everybody had a cell phone, let alone one of these really nice smartphones that we carry around now. The reason that so many people have a cell phone in this day and age is because the price came down because we got better at making them. We found different ways to make them quicker, make them better, and make them for less money. The same thing happened in the late 19th century, a time period that historians refer to as the Gilded Age. Now, before I go any further, when it comes to the economy, what I need you to understand is that every single aspect of the American economy was booming. Every industry, I don't care if you're talking about, lumber, coal, what have you, it's all going bonkers. And you can boil it down to one primary cause: the railroad. It's in the late 19th century that America not only builds a transcontinental railroad, it connects the East with San Francisco and everywhere in between. We lay over 100,000 miles of railroad track. Now think about this. What this does, very similar to mass production, is it makes it easier to do business. You now have more buyers that can buy things that aren't available on every street corner. As a matter of fact, a good Texas example, one of the things that really begins to take off in terms of profitability is beef, is cattle. Primarily because there was no way before the Missouri Central Railroad arrived in Fort Worth, there was no way to get your cattle all the way up to Chicago, where our good friend Jurgis Rudkis, the main character of The Jungle, could make it into roasts or steaks or ground beef or, any number of things that you use to produce beef with. The other thing that I need you to think about is what kind of things do you need to build a railroad? I mean, what material goes into building a railroad? Think about it for a second. On the most basic of level, you need people to build a railroad. And the simple fact of the matter is there's not enough American people. Even if you can assume for a second that they'd be willing to do the heavy grunt work of railroad work, there's not enough people to do this work. So you're going to have to bring people in from places like China, places like Italy, places like Mexico, places like the American South. What you're going to see is an influx of people into the United States. And those people need to eat, so you have another industry that has a ripple effect. The food industry takes off. The clothing industry takes off. In some cases, the housing industry takes off, because where are these people going to live? Recreation. Do you see the ripple effect? And that's just one aspect. You need things like steel. Steel production goes through the roof, and it makes people like Andrew Carnegie very, very, very wealthy men with the establishment of Carnegie Steel. You need lumber, so we hack down the forests of the Great Lakes region, later on the Pacific Northwest, in order to lay the lumber that ties the railroad tracks together. You need things like oil to lubricate the parts. You need coal to power the trains. And you also need people to finance it. You need bankers in the East, in places like New York, to fund the construction of the railroads. And as you know, they don't do that out of the kindness of their heart. They charge the people that are taking out money from them, they charge them interest. So the point is, the railroad industry really does serve as the stimulant of the American economy in the Gilded Age. It is the engine, no pun intended, the engine that is driving every other single aspect of the American economy. And the further we expand in terms of railroad mileage, the more the economy does really well. Now let's be sure about something. It is a bubble. In other words, it's a temporary thing. There's only so many trains you need. There's only so many tracks you need. At the time of the late 19th century, very good time for railroads. Let me talk a little bit about the consequences of this intercontinental railroad system. On the one hand, it's very, very nice, right? You can get things that were not available in specific parts of the United States. So think about California for a minute. Some of the things that grow out in California, citrus fruits, things like almonds, things that you can't get in, let's say, Virginia. When my grandfather was growing up, he used to say that one of the things that they would get for their Christmas presents would be things like fruit, exotic vegetables. And you think about that in today's standards, and you think, I hope you got something else in addition to that, because we're not used to not going into Tom Thumb or Kroger or what have you, and just picking up whatever we want, be they mangoes, corn, what have you. Anyway, it means that more people can buy the things that they want, and so the standard of American life is clearly on the rise. The problem, I guess I should say, is you now have big companies, the Walmarts of the late 19th century, that are able to compete with your mom and pop stores, right? So what this does is it gives rise to cutthroat competition. And just like in the 21st century, Walmart's way more able to compete when it comes to attracting buyers. They've got wholesalers. They've got an extensive legal department. They have a lot of different ways that they can dominate markets. And so what this is doing is it's pushing smaller producers out of the marketplace, which is a problem for reasons that you'll see later on in the lecture. Okay? Now, as I had mentioned before, this has a monumental impact on American life when it comes to rapid change. One of the places that you're beginning to see rapid change would be the American South. Now, the one thing that many northern American businessmen simply could not understand about the South in the day and age of the Civil War was, why was industry not, a really big part of life down there? They've got all these resources. The topography lends itself very well to the idea of industrialization, yet by and large you don't have any industry, okay? So in the aftermath of the Civil War, what a lot of American northern businessmen begin to do is they come down to the South in an effort to remake it in an industrial way. It's referred to as the New South. This is not going to be your grandfather's South that produced either tobacco or probably more likely cotton. It's going to have an industrial aspect to it. You're going to produce the tobacco, and then you're going to send it to the tobacco mill where it will be processed into cigarettes or cigars. You're going to grow the cotton in Mississippi and ship it to North Carolina, where it will be turned into textiles. I mean, why ship it all the way up to Boston, let alone all the way over to Manchester? You've got the material, the raw cotton right there. Let's just simply make the textile right next door. So, in short, that's primarily what you see is an economy that's primarily based in the South on raw materials. You do see an industrialization process in the South, but more times than not, they're working to produce things like lumber, coal, cotton, seafood. And as a result, this new South really wasn't as new as people like to believe it was. In a lot of instances, this is simply just working to supply the raw materials to more industrialized areas of the United States. Maybe one example would be a guy by the name of James B. Duke. Now, if that name Duke sounds familiar to you, it's because there's a university in Durham, North Carolina, named Duke. Duke University traces its roots back to James Duke and the tobacco industry. Now, the reason that Duke is so important is he had found a way to mechanize the production of cigarettes. He had found a machine that would roll cigarettes into cigarettes. And so essentially what he was able to do is reduce the cost of producing processed tobacco. So Duke becomes very famous and very rich in the process, and in large part outside of the textile mills of the Carolinas, it's really going to be the tobacco manufacturing industry that would be one of those emblematic industries that characterize the New South. Outside of that, you still have a primarily agrarian population and an agrarian farming-based economy. Some other consequences because of industrialization. Think about the main manufacturing centers in the late 19th, early 20th century. You're talking about places like Chicago. You're talking about places like New York. Later on, you're talking about places like Detroit. Why? That's where the people are, okay? Now you can make another case for that's where the waterways are as well. New York's got a grade A harbor, so it's easy to get around. But it also had a huge population. And anytime you have a huge population, you've got an abundance of labor. And so what that did is it made doing business in New York or Chicago infinitely cheaper than doing it in Wheeling, West Virginia, for instance, okay? So if you are an immigrant like Jurgis Rudkis, what you want to do is you want to move to the city. You get off the boat and you want to find Chicago because that's where the jobs are. That's where the manufacturing facilities are. So if you're that part of the jungle so far, you know that Jurgis's first words of English are Chicago. You know, he arrives in New York and Chicago this and Chicago that, and so they put him on a train, they ship him out to the west, and he gets off in Chicago, 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 and he needs to learn a new word, slaughterhouse, right? In this time period, Chicago was the meatpacking capital, arguably of the world. And so it's no coincidence that they send him to the meatpacking facilities, and that's where he finds a job. But think about it. He gets hired on his first day, primarily because he's this big, beefy guy, no pun intended, and he looks like he can do a lot of hard work. But in addition to him standing at the hiring gates, there are thousands of people that stand at the hiring gates. So anytime you've got a place with a large population, like Chicago, it's going to lower the price of labor, and that's going to make it easier and cheaper to do business. So that's why you see Chicago really booming, what we call urbanization, the development of cities. And in some instances, you see a population drain in various parts of the rest of the country, the South and the West, for instance. Now, these city centers are homes of great, unimaginable amounts of wealth, at the same time that they're home to grinding, unimaginable levels of poverty. There was an American author who I bet many of you have read, or at least heard about, a guy by the name of Mark Twain. Mark Twain, the same guy that wrote Huck Finn, novels like that, called this time period the Gilded Age. If you know what it means to gild something, dip it in something, it looks shiny, it looks pretty from an arm's length distance, but if you get up close and you scratch around at it, you'll find that it's not gold, it's not bronze, it's not copper at all. It's just been dipped into something to make it look pretty and shiny. That's a lot like American society in the late 19th century. from Europe, from Asia. It looks great. It looks as if the streets are paved with gold, everybody has a job, and everybody lives an infinitely higher standard of living than wherever you're talking about. Italy, for example. But when you get there, you find, as Jurgis Rutgers found, the streets were in fact not paved of gold. We'll talk more about the immigrant experience in a lecture later on in the semester. For the time being, I want to go back to this whole issue of the downside of industrialization. Now, if you're taking an economics class, your professor will introduce you to some of what they call market failures, right? A market failure can be described as something where the market doesn't produce something that is really essential. An example, maybe the best example, the military. I mean, there's not going to be any private company, private contractor that's going to establish a military, but a military is pretty important. A police force is pretty important. The reason that nobody's providing it is you can't really find any way to profit from it, right? But it's still necessary. So it's a market failure. In that case, the government needs to come in and provide that service that is not provided by private industry. Another market failure would be something called monopoly. Now, many of you are familiar with the board game Monopoly. What Monopoly actually is the complete domination of one industry by typically one company or just a small handful of companies. Let me give you an example. The textbook example of monopoly or monopolist in the Gilded Age would be a guy named John D. Rockefeller. Now, Rockefeller was an oil man, and people like him, in other words, it's not just him, but people like him understood bigger is better. And if you can get big quickly, you will ensure that your business has an up-teen times more likelihood of surviving. So if you can eliminate competition, you can do things like standardize the industry, and you can ultimately profit from it. I mean, it's kind of hard not to be number one when you're the only game in town, right? So anyway, Rockefeller established this company known as the Standard Oil Company, okay? You know that today as Exxon, one of the biggest and certainly one of the richest corporations in the world. Now, what Standard decided it was going to do was try to eliminate as much of its competition as humanly possible. So, in addition to having far more resources and just naturally being able to compete better in the marketplace, what they would do when they would compete against a rival company is charge just a little bit less for their products. In other words, crude oil is a little bit less expensive with Standard than it is with your mom and pop shop across the street. Well, where are you going to go for your petroleum? You know, I don't know if you're like me, but I don't really care what the sign says. It can have a Shell on it, it can be Racetrack, it can be Exxon. I really don't care. As long as it makes my car go, I go to the cheapest gas station in town. Well, that's what people did in the late 19th century. And naturally, your mom and pop, your smaller producers, had a choice. They either folded, and many of them did, or they sold out and became part of the Standard Oil Company. What's the problem with monopoly? The problem is the free market capitalism thrives, is doing best when companies are what economists call perfectly competitive. Now, when there's competition, you have a lot of incentive to do things like produce the best product for the least amount of money. Because if you've got a great quality product for a little bit of money, people will buy it, and they won't buy your competitors. If you don't have any competitors, there is no incentive to keep quality high and costs low. So not only can Rockefeller give us a half-rate product, he can also charge us whatever he wants for it. Okay? Now, as I mentioned, it's not just Rockefeller that can be described as a monopolist, or what a lot of historians call the robber barons, right? I'm talking about people like Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was a railroad tycoon. When Vanderbilt retired, he had more money to his own personal name than the entire U.S. Treasury. Now, I'm not saying that he's a bad guy just simply for being rich, but when you have wealth of that magnitude concentrated into a tiny segment of the population, it really lends itself well for economic disasters. And we found out the hard way what could happen if that happens in 1929. You had Andrew Carnegie of the steel industry. He would eventually set up not only one of the most successful corporations in the history of American business, one of the largest, the U.S. Steel Corporation. Unimaginable amounts of wealth. And the same problems that Standard Oil created are being seen in the U.S. Steel Company or Corporation or Vanderbilt's railroad corporations. Okay. Now, I'm hopeful that we can understand that this is producing jobs. It is absolutely producing jobs. In some cases, it's producing middle-class jobs. I mean, you need an army of white-collared workers to be able to standardize your production. You need managers, you need advertisers, you need financiers. But more often than not, what kind of jobs industrialization created would be unskilled or low-skilled labor. Now, Jurgis Rudkis would be a fantastic example of this. Do you know what Jurgis Rudkis does when he's initially hired? Did anybody catch that part? He's what's called a gut shoveler. There's nothing scientific to it. It's literally what he does. He pushes a shovel around the factory floor and he scrapes up all the innards of the slaughtered animals. He scrapes them into this big hole in the factory floor where machines grind it up. And I guess what comes out the other end would be chicken McNuggets, right? Anyway, you get the idea, okay? So you can be virtually anybody and do that. I'm not saying that it's not hard work and that you don't have to have a strong back to do it, but I'm saying it's not like he's a lawyer or a physician where he has some really developed skill set that sets him apart from 99% of the rest of the population. He's easily replaced. So do you ask for a raise? Do you ask for a break? Generally, no, you don't. You keep working, because if you don't, they'll find somebody else who does. It's a problem with these industrial jobs, okay? And it leads to what historians called institutionalized poverty. There's very little room for advancement here. And because they can replace you, it's not like they plan on paying you more year 2 than what you were earning in year 1. So anyway, generally speaking, this institutionalized poverty, impacted poverty, is generally handed down from one generation to the next. Jurgis's children, those that survive anyway, are generally less well off than even he was, and it's very unlikely that his children's children will break out of the ranks of poverty simply because there are so very few options, and a lot of this can be traced back to the industrialization of the economy. Okay? Now, inside the factory, there were all kinds of other extenuating circumstances that made working-class life in America very, very difficult. One of the things that I want you to be mindful of, and I've asked you to take a look at a reading this week for this, is the use of child labor. Now, why in the world would anybody want to use a 7-year-old, 8-year-old to work in a factory? Well, a couple reasons. One, they worked for very cheap. You could say, well, this isn't the provider for a family, so I'm going to pay him 50 cents when I'm really paying the man a dollar. Okay. The other reason, children are smaller. They've got smaller hands, for instance, and they can reach into parts of the machine and pluck out things that are obstructing the movement of gears and other equipment. The problem is you're talking about a 7-year-old, and he doesn't have the mental wherewithal to pluck something out really quickly, takes it out, takes a quick look at it, and then the machine gets going again and rips off his hand, arm, or worse, kills him. So these are some of the kind of conditions that we're talking about. I mean, there's an example in the jungle, for instance, when a bull gets loose on the killing floor, and it's chasing people around, and it's every man for himself, and Jurgis is running for his life. He steps in a pothole, busts up his ankle. There's no such thing as workers' compensation. You can't sue the company in the Gilded Age. It was every man for himself. So my point is, these working conditions are very dangerous to the point where people died, primarily because industries did not have any kind of accountability when it comes to providing a safe working environment. The government pretty much let industry and industrialists organize their factories, pay their workers, provide safety, not provide safety, as they saw fit. It's an issue called laissez-faire, and what that translates into in French is government hands off the economy. You don't have any kind of rules or regulations that are overseen by government in the factory that Jurgis works in. simply because most politicians felt that that would undermine the economy, that would actually make it more difficult for people like the meat packers to make a good business. To give you a better understanding of exactly what I mean by the working conditions inside the factory, I want you to take a quick look at a movie that was released in 1937 called Modern Times. Some of you may recognize the main character in that movie, a guy by the name of Charlie Chaplin, a very big name in the history of film. But watch approximately the first 15 or 20 minutes of the movie. As a matter of fact, you can put me on pause right now if you'd like to do that. I think what you're going to find is he works at a breakneck pace. There's very little, if any, time for him to slow down, kind of collect his thoughts. And the other thing that you're probably going to walk away with after you watch that film, that segment anyway, is you're probably going to say, you know, no normal human being can keep this up for a 20, 30, or more than that year career. In other words, things are going to break down on you. It's why you see so very few people that are able to be in the construction industry as an actual worker for much more than about 10 years. It's hard on your body. It's biology. It's going to break down. It's got nothing to do with hard work ethics or anything like that. So I'm hopeful that Modern Times gives you a really vivid understanding of exactly what kind of working conditions people like Jurgis Rudkis faced when they went to work every morning. Anyway, I'd like to also point out that when it comes to evidence for Paper One, you can absolutely use the scenes in Modern Times as evidence. In other words, you can say, this is why I think what I think, primarily because this is what I saw in Modern Times. Let's end with this. In a lot of instances, businessmen made so much money that they really could afford to not really worry about every minor detail of running their business. And in the aftermath of this, making their fortunes, a lot of them turned their attention to politics. They either became politicians themselves, or they sponsored political candidates for governorships or Senate seats, congressmen, and they essentially got them elected. Now, think about this. When you have a politician, that is an individual that is responsible for making decisions and implementing laws, or maybe a better way of looking at it during this time period, not making laws. So from the perspective of Andrew Carnegie, it makes a lot of sense to not have a law that says you must pay your workers a minimum wage. You must install a safety device that makes it safer to work in your steel plants. You must give your workers a 15-minute break every 4 hours that they work. You must give them a half hour for lunch. It makes better sense from their perspective to run their business as they see fit. Now, if you are able to provide the financial means to somebody that's running for a seat in the Senate, you can essentially say, here's $1 million to get yourself elected. What I want you to do is win the election, and then I'd really like you to kind of stay away from all this red tape regulation. I do not want to see a minimum wage. I do not want to see a maximum workday. I do not want to see any kind of government interference in the economy whatsoever. So, given the fact that you can see how and why Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, John Rockefeller, and the like have an incentive to control politics, you should have an understanding as to why the Gilded Age was sort of the golden age of corruption of American politics. You see unimaginable amounts of money that is being funneled into politics to get people elected so that when they get to Washington or Austin or wherever the case may be, they work for the corporation. They don't work for people like Jurgis Rudkis, let alone people like me and you. Let me give you one last example, and I bet it's going to be an example that sticks with you. 1896 is an important presidential election year for a lot of different reasons, but one of the reasons is a guy that's running for president on the Democratic ticket named William Jennings Bryan. And Bryan, at least on the campaign trail, talked a really good game about, being the champion of the farmer, being the champion of the worker, and producing an economy that worked for everybody and not just the rich factory elites. He was talking about regulation of the economy. He was talking about putting more money in the economy. And businessmen, especially people like John Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, decided maybe Bryan's not their man when it comes to the guy that they'd like to see be the next president of the United States. Now, the guy that's running on the Republican ticket is a guy from Ohio named William McKinley. Now, among other things, McKinley is one of these Republicans that believes that the most that any politician can do for the economy is nothing. In other words, leave it alone, let Carnegie run his business because he can run it a lot better than the government could. He knows a lot more than the government does. So that made him a very attractive candidate from big business standpoint. Anyway, in 1896, Carnegie and Rockefeller can do the math, and they say, you know what? We need McKinley to win this election. And one of the best things that you can do, whether you're talking about the 19th century, the 20th century, or the 21st century, money. Money never hurts when it comes to getting people elected. So Carnegie and Rockefeller got out their checkbooks, and they each tore out a check made payable to the McKinley campaign fund for $250,000. Now, first of all, $250,000 is chump change by 21st century standards. I mean, it costs millions and millions of dollars to run for president these days. But back then, $250,000 times 2, $500,000 was a sea of money. It was unfathomable. And so you can guess who won that presidential election. William McKinley is able to win the presidential election of 1896, and as a consequence, or maybe as a byproduct is a better way of saying it, you don't see any kind of real, meaningful regulation. And so the same problems of monopoly, of institutionalized poverty, of hazardous working conditions, hazardous living conditions, they all go on unaddressed, at least for the next 4 years. So, anyway, I'm hopeful that that sheds some light on what we've been talking about, and I think that you'll see that this dovetails with the politics of the late 19th century. Thanks.